Thanks, David. And can I invite the panel to now come and take your seat behind your name tag? And thanks, David, for setting me up as some sort of modern-day milk snatcher. I don't think I really said I didn't want children to have good food, but anyway. What we have before you is an absolutely stellar panel of people to discuss and debate the question of how do we get ageing onto the political agenda at all, but more importantly, how do we turbocharge the ambition around the ageing agenda? That's the sort of basic essay question that we're going to ask them all to offer a few opening remarks on before we go into some discussion together. So the first person I'm going to ask to talk about this, can I ask your colleague, do they need to use the handheld mics or will the table mics pick up? Handheld mics. Okay, so grab a handheld mic. First person I'm going to come to is Miranda Green, who's a journalist and commentator, as David mentioned. She's written about some of the aging challenges of ageing that she's seen through her own experiences with her dad. But I also am interested in your sort of broader views, because the challenges that David has set out are not new. But they do represent a complex web of issues. And when we see them played out in our own life, that's all too clear. So how do we bring political interest to a set of issues that are so complex and often multifaceted?
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me at the back. Slightly croaky, like everyone else in the country at the moment. Thank you so much for the invitation, and also congratulations on this piece of work, which is completely fascinating. You're quite right. The breadth of topics that are actually implicated in terms of policy formation, once you look seriously at an ageing society, means you have really set a challenge for the political class, I think, with this document. You know, I sort of wrote an essay last night, which I'm not going to read out to you on this topic, because, you know, I've spent sort of much of the last 5 years looking after a father who was dying of dementia, and now sort of looking after my mum, who turned 90 last week. Go, mum. Thank you. So I feel like I'm sort of on the sharp end of much of this sort of social care conversation, apart from anything else. And also, as a woman in my 50s, trying to hold down a job whilst caring for them, I'm really, really aware that the sort of coming ageing generation, of which I suppose I'm a member, has got a terrible kind of financial problem as a result of our ageing responsibilities, because the care system doesn't work. So, you know, anyway, I will not read you out my personal essay about that, my experiences. But on this broader topic of the political agenda, I think this is so interesting. In your kind of intro, you talk about the enormous potential and it mustn't be wasted. So I think the problem you've got with this is that these background giant policy threats / opportunities are trying to break through in an age of crises, you know, polycrisis as it's been dubbed. And we've also got a very sort of short-termist cadre and generation of politicians. So I think it is genuinely tough. But the opportunity is there, because some of these sort of micro social crises, like social care, have become so pressing that they just have started to sort of, I don't know if my colleagues on the panel would agree with me, but they've actually started to impress themselves on the political conversation of ordinary voters and of the electorate, even though the political class has an inquiry from time to time, has a royal commission, shelves it, hopes everyone's forgotten about that issue, moves on. You know, Andrew Dilnot every 4 years pops up on the news to say why nobody ever implemented the last set of proposals he was asked, you know. But I think it's actually become, for families and therefore for voters, such a pressing issue that you know, the human stories are the way to sort of make the argument with the political class. One thing I really like about your piece of work is that, having toured around the party conferences this season, there are two political conversations going on, both of which are at the wrong level, it seems to me. One is an incredibly airy-fairy conversation about how we would design an ideal society, in which people say, let's not talk about all the terrible problems in the NHS, let's talk about the fact that when people are asked about health policy, they want green spaces and they want clean air. And all of this is true and important to consider, but it actually doesn't get you very far. And then there's another, even worse conversation, which is at what they, in the awful jargon, the retail politics level, which is, okay, we've looked at some spreadsheets and we worked out during an intensive afternoon in a policymaker's basement that if we do this hypothecated tax, we can buy X number of dentists, or whatever it is, which is also hopeless in terms of the policy challenge. I think this piece of work is really important because, and also the way that you've laid it out, I think you can actually present it to the political class as we've thought this through and we've got these bold ideas, but some of them are very practical and they're almost kind of ready to pick off the page. So I think you actually, in a sense, might be pushing at an open door because I think a lot of people, Andrew might disagree because, he spends his entire time doing serious policy work, not the silly policy work that a lot of the political parties do. But I think, hitting this sweet spot of things that, admit to the scale of the challenge, but don't get lost in a sort of airy-fairy conversation. I think you've done very good work on that. I would just, one little plea on this whole conversation is just to recognise how different women's lives are. Both in terms of everything from pension income to caring responsibilities to the pattern of women's working lives, therefore. I think that's quite important to remember in all parts of the conversation. And just finally, elderly people in politics are talked about a lot, but usually only through one prism, which is the triple lock on the state pension and the grey vote. And there's this really weird way in which the elderly in the UK political conversation are only present in relation to how they behave on polling day every 5 years, and not actually in the terms that you want to have this conversation. I think that's also something you need to break down, is the awful narrative about intergenerational war, because I think that's actually become really, really unhelpful to finding policy solutions or having a constructive conversation. And I'm going to leave, I've got so much more to say, but we'll probably get to all of that in the questions. I'm going to leave
Thanks
that.
so much. Great. So might as well pass the mic on. So the next person to just offer a few opening remarks is Andy Harrop from the Fabian Society. Andy, you go back on this ageing agenda for quite a few years. You've been part of the work to try and shift this conversation for a long time. How can we do that? And how can we particularly, as Miranda sort of just set up, widen the conversation about ageing so it's not just a conversation about older people?
Just to finish when Miranda said, if you're thinking about how to engage politicians, you really need to think about the story of long lifespans from young people onwards. And anything, I think, in this moment we are that feels like it's just about electoral bungs for particular age groups really isn't going to resonate. So, which isn't to say that politicians don't slice and dice the electorate and think, have we got the right offer? So, to pick up what Miranda said, I think all political parties will be thinking about how do we make sure that people in midlife really want to vote for us, because they're the sort of like the pivot age group, and in the electoral, and if you're in your late 50s or 60s, you are the person who will decide this election. So making sure that, carers who are still looking after sort of kids as they get into their 20s while also looking after mum and dad, that's a really important electoral demographic. But we don't want to get sort of overly fixated about electoral politics, but that's how politicians think, and there will be moments where David, your proposal for carers leave, Fabians have actually put out a very similar proposal. That's potentially a retail policy that could resonate with a specific group. So I think there's reason for optimism, and if you look back on some areas of the policies that we think about, there are successes. So let's give politicians credit for the progress they've made on pensions, even though it's an imperfect, unfinished journey. It's a hell of a lot better than it was 15 years ago. So it's sort of like, how can you apply similar sort of set of tools, ways of talking about issues to other areas, of which I would say social care is, sort of a critical starting point. And I think there are three, and the headwinds are really bad as well. So the headwinds we know about, firstly, this is not front of mind. It's not the first thing people talk about on the doorstep to a politician. There's no money. I'm sure Paul will say more about that. But, the first job of the an incoming Labour government for the next couple of years will be stopping cuts happening rather than deciding where to spend more money. And as others have already said, it's such a siloed area, not having a single, sort of line of responsibility through the conventional sort of Whitehall channels does create real problems here. So I think there are sort of three different types of solution. The first is to sort of longevity-proof, age-proof everything that government is thinking about. So in your report, you talk about, for example, housing, transport, great places to live for everyone. And, that's an agenda which, it won't work if you haven't got the interests of each age group sort of built in. But there are sort of, if you like, there's work and train on those issues. Like the next government will fixate on housing, not only for electoral reasons, but because it's the internal dynamic of the Labour Party to fixate on housing. They love it. So that in those sorts of cases, it's about making sure that longevity is sort of like just built into those processes. Then I think there's a sort of like an institution building job, and sort of like how do you reshape the sort of both sort of welfare state institutions, but broaden that, the institutions of the country, of our society, to better meet solutions. And you sort of like, you do your design first, even if you haven't got the money yet to pay for it. And the big example here is social care, where I think I'm more optimistic than some that the work that the Fabian Society have done with the Labour front bench on building a national care service. And I think that there is a roadmap there that a future set of politicians won't deliver overnight, but they realise the scale of the problem and realise that the last 20 years is sort of just, it's broken. And this is where political, sort of ambition comes into it. I think that an incoming group of ministers will want to have something to show for themselves after 5 years. And, it may not, I don't think that building a national care service is the first, the fifth, the 15th priority of an incoming Labour government. But if an individual minister wants to show that they change the country, it's actually a pretty good, sort of symbolic thing to do. And then the final, so the sort of like, so institution building. And then the final area, I think, is really important, is basically where we are just approaching a crisis point, and there is no alternative to radical rupture. And the point here is basically, I think, the interface between health and work. And your report really brings us in. The problem is not our ageing society, it's the fact that we're not ageing. A healthy life expectancy, and you point to statistics where it's going backwards, and we have, and of course I worry about healthy life expectancy for all age groups, but there's the economic implications of what's going on with the nation's health are so serious, but from an economic perspective as well as our own well-being. We already are seeing a huge labour supply crunch, because we aren't healthy enough in our working lives, and that's physical health and mental health. And that, I think this is an area where any future government, is not a party political point, will have to make intervention, because and those interventions are, I think, a transformation in our approach to public health, a nanny state on steroids to support health, linked to having to get to completely change how we're thinking about inequality and poverty, because that is driving so many of our health concerns. And then sort of further sort of like downstream, thinking much harder about how we help people in their mid-50s onwards to the pension age stay in work as they have their health problems. And this is not a nice to have. The fact that so many people are stopping working way before the pension age is terrible for their lifetime prospects, but it's also a massive problem for the economy. So I think every politician, any party, is going to have to act on that.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Now come to Paul, Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Paul, a lot of the framing of the paper that ILC have put out today is that we need to change our perspective about what we can afford because there is a potential longevity dividend. How realistic do you think it is in the current climate we find ourselves to really inject some optimism about the economics of ageing? Just a little question for 2 minutes.
I'm never the right person to come to for optimism. But if anyone was confused about what David was saying about the TikTok video on VAT, it's all about rabbits. If you want a pet, get a rabbit, because there's no VAT on rabbits because they're edible.
Bleak.
One of the many great things in my new book, Follow the Money, so do buy that. In terms of the question, look, I think there clearly are. I mean, an ageing population is one where the state's going to be spending more on health and pensions and so on, and that clearly creates issues around fiscal sustainability. It's one of the reasons why taxes are rising very, very fast at the moment. Not the only reason, but it's one of the main reasons why taxes are rising very, very fast, and I don't think they're going to go back down again. But I think sort of to cover some of the points that we've been looking at, there are clearly some opportunities here. I mean, one is how we think about pension income. I mean, one of the things that I think worries me, but something we could potentially do something about, is the way that we are moving actually to a world in which we don't have private pensions. I mean, there are none. So we have auto-enrollment, but that's essentially into a savings pot. It's nothing to do with pensions. You don't annuitize it. You don't risk share. You just put money in a pensions pot and then you pull it out at some point in the future. Now, one of the problems with that, and one of the opportunities, as it were, is we know that people post-pension age do not spend the money that they have. If they've got a decent amount of money, on average, they just don't spend it. And so there is obviously an opportunity for the economy if they were to be consuming more of that, or indeed if they would be saving, and this is a very countercultural thing to say, but for a group of the population, if they were saving less earlier in their life. That's going to be less of a problem in the future than it is at the moment. I mean, there's over-saving among current pensioner generation. There's going to be a lot less of that later on. But this issue about how you help people draw down that pension pot in later life, I think, is absolutely crucial, and one that I don't think we talk about anywhere near enough, and can make a big difference to the quality of life of individuals and an economic difference. I think that's one real priority. Second thing that people have touched on is this issue about when people leave the labour force. It is astonishing that it remains the case that men in their early 60s today are less likely to be in work than men in their early 60s in 1970, despite the fact that men in their early 60s in 1970 were pretty likely to die pretty soon, and that's no longer the case. And so the amount of time that people spend out of the labour force post-retirement is much, much, much longer, and a lot of it's relatively healthy life as well. So there are opportunities there. Although it's worth saying, and this is absurdly oversimplifying, but we put out a report which shows this in very broad terms a month or so ago. Of those people, and I'm talking about men here because obviously the trends for women have been very different. Of those men who leave work in their early 60s, one group are pretty well off, they can afford to, and there's a question about how they might be supported or incentivized to stay longer. And the other group are those with very low levels of income, and they really struggle because income for people on benefits before pension age is much less than half what they get when they hit pension age, and that's one of the consequences of one of the problems, as it were, of raising the state pension age, is it leaves a group of people in dire poverty for a little bit longer. Those are very often people with poor health and poor levels of education. And actually that's something that is true across the age groups. If you look right across the age groups, who are the people on disability benefits, for example? Overwhelmingly people with low levels of education. And actually if you're a low-educated 30-year-old, you're much more likely to be on a disability benefit than a high-educated 60-year-old. Now that is extraordinary, and that is part of a much broader set of issues. And then the third sort of issue, I think, which has been raised, I think is desperately important, is that of housing. And again, there are opportunities there because we have a completely insane system for taxation of housing, which locks people into the houses that they have, if only a minority of older people ever sell their house and trade down, partly because the whole tax system says stay put because it's incredibly expensive to do that, and then you might have that house adapted, but then the next family moving in will unadapt it until they're old, and rather than actually allowing people or even incentivizing people to move where they need to. The current system of taxation of housing is absolutely ludicrous. And the last thing I'd say is the point about wealth across the generations. And I think Miranda's right that we talk far too much about intergenerational warfare, as it were. What actually the concentration of wealth is doing is it's concentrating it within families. So the importance of inheritance is so much more important than it was a generation ago. So people born in the 1980s are going to get, on average, about twice as much inheritance as people born in the 1960s, but obviously incredibly unequally distributed. And because wages have stagnated, inheritance is a much more important part of people's lifetime incomes. And so this is not so much an issue about inequality between generations, but it's creating greater and greater inequality within generations, because increasingly the most important decision you make in life is who you choose as your parents.
Thanks very much. The final person to speak from our panel is Alice Johnson from Times. Alice, if politicians are not worrying about ageing, how do we change that?
So 20 years ago, I was sent to Japan to do a piece on their terrible ageing population. And the first thing I discovered when I went round a supermarket with one of the GPs was the fact that they had more adult nappies than baby nappies. And when I wrote about this, the Times actually thought I couldn't have got it right, and they were appalled by this statistic. And no one ever thought it could happen in Britain. I think that was the weird thing. We saw this Japanese problem as a specifically Japanese weirdness, a bit like, what they wore or food, or it was just different. It wasn't going to ever be us. And so I have gone back a lot, and I also have eaten their school food, and I have seen what they've tried to do. They do measure all, which is extraordinary, all their workforce are measured once a year to make sure that they're not too large, which you cannot imagine happening, I think, in this country. I would be terrified, but I am quite a fattist in that way. I think it would be a good idea. And when we have to accept now, I think, 20 years on, that Britain is getting older, and we are having fewer children. And we know that women have 1.56 children, which is hard to do, but we need to get that up more. But I think the idea that we demand that women breed without, as Miranda said, giving women any help to do that, or to look after their elderly, or in any way, we've gone back to this old-fashioned idea that we are literally just breeders. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think we've got 16 million pensioners by 2040, and we are going to have to look, as you said, at how we improve those pensioners' lives. And I think it is about quality, not quantity. Miranda and I both got the same problem in that we had parents with dementia. My father had dementia for 25 years, which is a long time, actually. And the only thing I would say is he was extremely fit and healthy. And that sounds terrible, and that sounds like maybe that's why he lived so long, and maybe that wasn't a good thing. But it was, because he was very mindful. Because he was fit, he could walk around. We went on walks. He would look at flowers and butterflies, and actually it was rather wonderful in some ways. I was lucky he wasn't he wasn't violent, he wasn't tricky, but although it cost a vast amount of money, he was fit enough to have some sort of quality of life, and that's what's important. It is the quality of life, I think, we need to look at. I hate the word comorbidities. It's one of my least favourite words. I think it sounds dreadful, but we have got to make sure that people have fewer comorbidities. And I think there is something very easy the government can do on that. I think we need to have things like a sugar tax. I found the KFC extraordinary that we allow these companies to literally push bad food on our children and then on us as adults. And I think it would be very easy, and I've never understood why we don't do it, to have a sugar tax. We know it worked. It's worked in Mexico, it's worked in Canada, it can work in Britain, and it has a huge impact on what we eat. We are being pushed constantly to eat more sugar and to eat more bad food. I don't think that's a particularly expensive point for the government. So that would be the first thing if we're thinking about, things the government can do. I don't think we can ever say it's just the government, though. I think one of the most important authors that I've ever interviewed is someone called Miranda Green, who was the psychologist for President Mitterrand, and she wrote some extraordinarily good books that you should all read about growing old well. And the French grow old really badly. They are grumpy. And what you can never be is grumpy as you grow old. It's the most important thing to think about. Because what she said is that if you're grumpy, no one wants to talk to you. No one wants to see you. No one wants to be part of your community. If we want the elderly to be part of a community, they've got to help too. And so she described it like this. If you see a scooter going down the street and you're an elderly person, don't look at that little child on the scooter and think, oh my God, what are they doing? That's dangerous. Why are they there? Think, that's fun. I once had a scooter. And it's the same with ChatGPT. If you hear your grandchildren are talking about something called ChatGPT, ask them about it. Or Riz, ask them, what is this word, Riz? You know, engage with the young. And I think that's really important for the elderly. We need to tell them that. Don't be miserable. You know, be someone fun to be around. And it's so important. And I think that increasingly. And I've said to my family, if I become dull, boring, miserable, and cross with you the whole time, do tell me. Because we want the elderly to engage. So I think that's what the elderly can do. I think for the government, as well as actually having a sugar tax, I think we talk about care homes, but it's actually because we like the murder mysteries in care homes. You know, the best-selling book is about murder mysteries in care homes. We're interested in care homes. But the government has had a huge problem with that. And I think these 16 reports on social care, all of which I've had to read, as has Miranda, as has Paul, we've all written about them endlessly. Nothing has ever happened. Every single manifesto that has put anything about social care in has been a disaster. Theresa May nearly lost her election because of her death tax. They're always called death tax. And George Osborne is the biggest problem on this. He really goes for it if he sees anyone trying to cost elderly care. So I think we need to start having cross-party consent on it. I think we need to pull it out of politics. I think we need to look at funding and pension age. I think we need to look at it in a different way, and it cannot be party political or short-term anymore. I think then next what we have to do is what the Swedish do and embrace death cleaning. And I think death cleaning is a phenomenally good idea. And I've interviewed Margareta Magnusson, who's introduced the British to it for her book. And what it means is when you get to 60, you stop, you think what you're doing, and you decide maybe you want another job, a part-time job, a different job. In Sweden, they're bus drivers, they're tourism helpers, they do all sorts of different things. They go into primary schools, and they are helped to do that with companies that try and find you fun part-time jobs. And I think that would be great in Britain. Every time I write about the over 60s having to do more work, our readers are fuming. They're furious. They're like, why should we? But Sweden make it fun and they make it relevant. And I think that's really important. They also downsize their houses. As Paul said, it's really important to get out of a house and downsize. And we should help people do that. And the Swedes do it naturally. They never stay in a house. They try and move into a smaller flat. Finally, I think, and most importantly, it's what Miranda says, we've got to stop the intergenerational warfare. We love talking about it in newspapers. We do stir it up. I think Gen Z and boomers, you know, between them, it becomes really sort of pointless, the fight, actually. And you're right, it's not the right way of looking at it. And I think at their best, the countries that do best are the ones where the Gen Z and boomers work together. They live together. I think for Gen Z, it's really important that housing is part of the solution for the boomers. I think childcare can help. I think that actually we should look at the boomer generation as helping with childcare and give them more chances to do that. And I think we should look at the countries that have worked. Japan has not worked, but Holland's worked, Sweden's worked. So I think we should look to them. And I think we should all try and be happier in old age. Think about it as a problem that we can solve as well as the government. And I think the government can get on and do some practical solutions that actually won't cost too much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think you've had a lot of food for thought. What I'm going to do is, because time is relatively tight, I'm going to sweep up a number of comments from the audience all at once and then give the panel a very short opportunity to pick their favourite and respond to it or offer another final thought. I think you've heard quite a few things. You've had a rallying cry for the nanny state, or nanny state on steroids from lots of people. I think there's been a lot of discussion about housing. I think it's interesting. Inevitably, we've also talked about pensions and social care. We're never going to not do that. But I think, you know, if only we could broaden this debate about ageing, even as we have in this discussion today in the public domain. So I'm interested in thoughts from the audience. If anybody that is thinking of wanting to speak puts their hands up, I will select as many as I can. So, right. And at this point, I've gone slightly blind. Okay, can I suggest, just to save Linda's feet, the lady with the green scarf goes first, just near you.
I will. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I suggest that lifetimes filled with learning and earning and a few years of financially rewarded time off at intermittent intervals should be the way that life goes in this country.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and admirably succinct. So that is the model. Actually, if we come forward, there's a person in a black and white.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I work in Scotland, and currently going through Scottish Parliament is the National Care Service Bill. It's been halted because of various scrutiny process from various committees. So how do you think that we can make social care be at the priority list? Well, they're obviously trying to do that in a Scottish context, but it's not really working as it stands.
Excellent. Raining hands. So the gentleman just here.
Sorry, Chris Jeffrey, Mending the Gap. It's just about, I noticed Andrew was talking about social care. I've been campaigning for paid care leave for 14 years. How do we stop governments from looking at the financial implications rather than the benefits, when the benefits outweigh the losses?
Absolutely. Thank you. I come to Ken and then the gentleman in the front row. So you're just keeping coming down. Okay. Oh, yep, go ahead. Yep.
Thank you. Ken Blueston from Age International. I want to pick up on the International Longevity Centre. The majority of older people today actually live in lower income countries, and the vast majority are going to be living in these countries in just a few short decades. So how do we get this reality onto the political agenda?
Fantastic. Gentleman here.
Thank you. Chet Selvaraj from Independent Age. Does the government Whitehall system have the capacity, the institutional capacity, to start looking at these issues, and what would need to change to enable it to think about some of these issues more long term? And acknowledging some of the costs involved, do we need to just accept we need a larger state?
Fantastic. Great. Who else was keen to speak? So I've got lady here, and then gentleman there, and then lady at the back.
Digital exclusion. What can governments do to ensure more older people can get online?
Wonderful. People of all ages, I would say, because it's not just older people that are digitally excluded. Gentleman there.
Hello, Stephen Stern. I arrived today in my dad's old hat and coat, and it's a connection, literally and metaphorically. And I just want, it's a pompous word, but, you know, what do we still revere? Us journalists are cynical and bleak, and we're irreverent. But I think David's point about multi-generational spaces rather than places to hire, I thought that was a very telling comment. So how do we get some reverence back? It's hard to measure in economic terms, put a value on it, but is that something that's missing?
Great. And then it was the lady with the black top on the very back row.
Could I just ask you, Viva Wittenberg-Cox, if I could ask you to dig just slightly deeper into the gender lens. What I hear from you is women are now working more than men in their later age. They're also encouraged to have more children, take more care of their elders, and suffer a 40% gender pension gap. So what do we do with the ladies who live longer and maybe are hope out of this?
Correct. Okay, and then just the final comment from the lady in the red there, the front, and that is all I can take.
So picking up on Miranda's comment, and this is a question particularly for Paul, why is it if you care for your parents unpaid, you're seen as less productive by economists than if you work as a paid carer?
Thank you.
That's what when I hear you on the radio, that's what I always want to ask you.
Some very big questions there. What I'm going to do is just sweep this way, so starting with Alice, just to pick up on one or two of the comments. You've got kind of, 0 seconds, so succinct responses.
Very quickly, paid carers, I think that is vital now. I've just interviewed Ed Davey. He lost both his parents. He cared for his mother in childhood, who had cancer, and he is caring for a disabled child now. I think the Lib Dems are producing a lot of the solutions. Actually, I think having seen his life and having cared for 5 people throughout his life, all for free, I think it's actually the most pressing reason I've seen for voting Lib Dem, oddly. He is extraordinary, and I think anyone who is a carer is extraordinary, and there are up to 10 million carers in this country, and we need to look seriously at them. I also think the women's issue, it is almost always, I'd say, well, we know it's 78% of women are the carers. I think we need to address that. I think we did that with parental care, and we've moved the dial on that. I think we need to do it with elderly people and with disabled children. I think it's a similar situation there. And just to pick up one last thing, on the short-termism, I do think that is our biggest problem, is that it's all politicians only think of the short term and they're too nervous, and I think we need to pull this out and make it a cross-party issue on longevity and on looking at how we tackle social care.
Excellent. Paul.
Thank you. As one directed at me specifically, I mean, when you're measuring, there is a measure of GDP, which is probably what you're talking about, which measures paid work and doesn't measure unpaid work, and that is unquestionably only part of the story. And we're kind of probably not very good at saying that's only part of the story, but it is only part of the story, and we should recognise that. In terms of a couple of the other questions, I think it's really interesting. This question about shouldn't we be able to take a year or two off in the middle of life rather than basically saving it all up until we're hopefully still young enough to enjoy it, but we might not be. I mean, I think that would be great, but I think it is very, at the moment, people clearly see it as very risky. And coming to the issue around women, you do see that if people do take time off in the middle of life, often for when they have children, it has long-term negative consequences on their earnings, and that is a real problem with the way the labour market works. And actually, even taking a period of time part-time work has really big negative consequences on future earnings. So people are acting rationally by not doing it, but how you change the way the labour market works there until you actually get I think it's one of these things where you need a big change in social norms, which are very difficult to achieve. It's a question about do we have the institutional capacity, and do we need a bigger state in face of where we are? I think at the moment we don't have that institutional capacity. If you look at social care, it's overwhelming local government to some extent. I mean, this is now more than half of everything that local government does, and the pressures are just extraordinary. So I think we need to think about governance in that sense. But as I was saying earlier, if you think about the size of the state that's going to be required to pay for health, social care and pensions, it is going to be bigger in the future. And my view is we should accept that. I mean, there is no point getting richer if we're miserable and sick and dead. So we might as well spend the money stopping ourselves being miserable and sick and dead.
Brilliant.
Starting off with carers, I mean, this sort of goes back to what is the social contract between people who are of working age and have good reason for not working, and that includes carers, but it's also parents of young children, people with significant long-term disabilities. Are we happy as a society for those people to live way below the poverty line for years and years and years? And it's an incredibly expensive question to raise, but I think an incoming government of the left will not be doing its job if it does not start that debate, which has not been happening for the last decade. And carers are the sort of a really good fault line issue of what is the settlement? And it's not amazing for pensioners, but if you compare our pension social security system for people on low incomes to people younger than pension age with good reason not to be working, it pulls apart. More specifically on carers, I think that there is an opportunity to have chunks of paid carers leave, which are there to help people balance caring and working. So they're there. I mean, just giving people the right to 2 weeks of paid carers leave a year that you take in bits and pieces throughout the year would make a huge difference to your ability to balance. And to the point, to David's proposal and the similar Fabian proposal, some people need a chunk of time out of work, which is, you know, sort of probably going to be for some, you know, it might be 3 months, it might be 12 months, but it's a sort of a known quantity, and you would then expect to return to work. I mean, the most sad example of this is caring for someone with a terminal illness. And there is a really good analogy with maternity leave and similar, and I think we absolutely should create a system that works for that group. And to the point about the National Care Service and Scotland has, their process has stalled because they did not build the consensus and partnership and evolve from the system that existed. They wanted to create a top-down new thing without bringing the local local authorities, the providers with them. And what we've been looking at in England is how to start with what you've got and help the partners in the system do the job they want to do. And that, Paul just touched on it, but it fundamentally comes back to the national enabling of the capacity and fair funding of local commissioners to help local providers do the job they want to do.
Absolutely brilliant questions. I'll go really, really quickly. On the political process and carers leave and all of that, there's actually a really good example at the moment, because there was a private member's bill, Wendy Chamberlain, who I think is a Lib Dem chief whip actually, she managed to get effortless cross-party agreement to get at least a right to unpaid leave for carers. So let's just push that open door, because I think my colleagues are right that there is an open door until you get to the point of the things that cost a lot of money, where there is not an open door and it's much, much harder. Whitehall capacity, yeah, the silos that have already been described are a huge problem, and I agree we need some sort of way of taking it beyond politics. There are precedents. I mean, the way that university finance was kind of stitched up in a cross-party way before the 1997 election is actually a model where you can take some really tough, really expensive problem and get people to promise to implement a huge report. And it holds at least for kind of 15, 20 years. It's now collapsing around us, obviously, that agreement on university finance, but there are precedents there for getting it done. I'm really interested in Stefan's question about multi-generational sort of spaces and all of that. Actually, this is the one thing where I have a problem with some of the proposals in the report, because I think that establishment of different social norms, as Paul's put it, is really hard. I mean, I think this is the most difficult thing, and obviously agree on sugar tax, you know, agree on some of this kind of let's have proper nanny statism to herd everyone towards being healthier. But actually, I mean, I obsessively watch that Netflix program about all the centenarians, for example. If you look at the places where everyone's healthy and happy and 100, these are very old-fashioned societies. These are faith-based communities with a very traditional family structure where the old people are just effortlessly brought to the table along with the young people, you know, and these are places where female roles are very traditional, for example, you know. So if we're actually going to create a modern British society that doesn't look like a tiny Sardinian village, you know, but where people are happy and healthy and live to 100, that is a really tough ask. And I'm not totally convinced about kind of public buildings that are multi-generational hubs. It sounds a little bit too much like the place at the end of my street, which is just to sort of hang out for people dealing drugs at the end of the day. Do you know what I mean? Like, actually, in practical terms, making that sort of multi-generational ideal work, when the places where it works best are very, very old-fashioned societies, that's a tough ask.
Do you want a last word, David?
No, I think I could talk for hours, and actually, let me pick up on the gender point. Sorry, gender point. Switzerland is number one in our global index. If we included women, it wouldn't be. If we separated men and women, the situation wouldn't be. I think the point about, you know, that women are blamed often for not having enough children. The reality is, as we get richer, we have fewer children. Our dependency ratio would increase if we actually had a lot more children now for 25 years. It's not the solution in the short term. And public policy in Hungary, Poland, Romania, where else? Japan has failed to do it. So let's stop blaming women and get on with delivering better long lives.
Thank you. Okay, I have slightly eaten into your break time, I'm afraid, but hopefully you'll now agree that we've solved ageing. So, you know, it was good work. I think, you know, we have had a lot of discussion. There are lots and lots of ideas in the 100 Out report, and the idea of that is to stimulate a broader, more ambitious, more open conversation. And I think hopefully we have at least started that today and will continue it over the coming days. You are free to go and get some coffee and take a break. The ask is that you're back here at 10:55 for a conversation when we'll be looking at health in an ageing society. So can I just thank the panel and ask you to... And we'll see you on the other side of a break.